They called him the Ghost of the West Side. When the explosion took Arthur Cornero's eyes, it didn't take his grip on the city's underworld. It made him colder, ruthless. He ruled in complete darkness, and his men walked on eggshells, terrified that a wrong breath would trigger his wrath. Then came a temp agency girl who didn't know the rules. She didn't whisper. She didn't tremble. She just walked into his office and asked if he took sugar. The waiting room smelled of expensive leather and cheap fear. Nora Hayes sat with her posture aggressively straight, staring at a patch of grey carpet. She needed this job. Her bank account was overdrawn by $200. Her landlord had started leaving voicemails instead of texts, and she was currently surviving on saltines and spite. The heavy mahogany doors to the inner office clicked open. A woman in a tailored skirt suit burst out, her face blotchy and wet. She wasn't just crying, she was hyperventilating, clutching a leather-bound notebook to her chest like a shield. She didn't look at Nora. She just bolted for the elevator, leaving behind a faint trail of expensive perfume and panic. Next, the voice didn't come from the crying woman. It came from the man standing in the doorway. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nora's car. His nose had been broken at least twice. He looked at Nora with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "You the girl from the agency?" he asked. "Nora," she said, standing up and smoothing down the front of her thrifted blazer. "Yes," the man sighed. "I'm Vincent. I'm going to give you the same speech I gave the last 4. Speak only when spoken to. Do not move things on his desk. Do not touch him. If he asks you to read a document, read it exactly as it is printed. No summarizing." Vincent paused, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "And don't patronize him. If you do, you won't just get fired." Nora nodded. She didn't ask what "won't just get fired" meant. She didn't care. "What's the pay again?" Vincent blinked, thrown off by the question. $40 an hour, double overtime." "Great, let's go." Vincent stepped aside, opening the heavy doors wider. The office inside was massive, taking up the entire corner of the top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the city skyline, steel and glass catching the late afternoon sun. But the heavy blackout curtains were drawn tight. The room was submerged in a stifling, unnatural twilight. Behind a massive oak desk sat Arthur Cornero. He was younger than the rumors made him out to be, maybe in his early 30s. He had thick, dark hair and a strong jaw covered in a faint shadow of stubble. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thick forearms wrapped in faded, sprawling tattoos. He was striking, in a harsh, jagged sort of way. A deep, angry red scar carved its way from his left temple, slicing down across his eyelid and terminating at his cheekbone. His eyes were open, but they were milky, unfocused. "Dead." Nora stopped 2 feet from the desk. Vincent closed the doors behind her with a soft click, leaving her alone with the ghost of the West Side. Silence stretched. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of heavy, expectant quiet that made the air feel thick in your lungs. Arthur sat perfectly still, his head tilted slightly to the right, listening. "You breathe loudly," Arthur said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It didn't boom, but it demanded the entire room's attention. "I have a deviated septum," Nora replied, her tone flat. "And I walked up 3 flights of stairs because your lobby elevator is broken." Arthur's head snapped toward the sound of her voice. For a split second, Nora felt the instinct to step back. The intensity of his blind stare was unnerving. He was used to people crumbling when he focused on them. "The last one cried because I asked her to describe the room," Arthur said, his voice laced with bored cruelty. "She told me it was very nice." I threw a glass at the wall. Then she cried. "I saw her leaving," Nora said. She looked like she was having a bad time. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. Describe the room. Nora didn't hesitate. It's depressing. You have a corner office with $1 million view of the skyline, and you've got it boarded up like a doomsday bunker. The carpet is navy blue. The walls are panelled in some kind of dark wood, probably mahogany. It smells like stale coffee and cigars. There's a stain on the rug near the door that looks suspiciously like bleach trying to cover up blood. And your desk is completely bare, except for a braille clock and a stack of manila folders. A muscle feathered in Arthur's jaw. You have a smart mouth. I have $50 to my name, and rent is due in 3 days, Nora corrected. I don't have the luxury of a smart mouth. I just don't have the energy to tiptoe around you. Do you want me to read the folders or not? Arthur was silent for a long time. His fingers drummed a slow, rhythmic beat on the leather armrest of his chair. Read the red one first, he finally said. They're all manila, Nora replied. The one on the top. Nora stepped forward, picked up the top folder, and opened it. It was a list of names, addresses, and numbers that looked like cargo shipments. She started reading. She didn't stumble. She didn't soften her voice. She read the brutal, dry mechanics of a criminal empire with the same detached professionalism she would use to read a grocery list. When she finished, she closed the folder. Next, Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. You aren't afraid of me. I'm afraid of being homeless, Mr. Cornero, Nora said, placing the folder back on the desk exactly where she found it. You're just a guy who needs someone to read his mail. Arthur's unseeing eyes stayed locked on her face. Then, very faintly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. Make me a coffee, Nora, black. By day 4, Nora understood why the turnover rate was so high. It wasn't just the danger, though that was a constant, thrumming undercurrent. It was Arthur. He was a man who had spent his entire life in absolute control, only to have his autonomy violently stripped away. He compensated by being a tyrant. He demanded perfection. He threw tantrums, though they were cold and quiet ones. He would intentionally drop things to see how fast people scrambled to pick them up. He would ask questions he already knew the answers to, just to see if his subordinates would lie. His men treated him like an unexploded bomb. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones. They never disagreed. They never corrected him. Nora did. It was Tuesday afternoon. The office was stiflingly quiet. Arthur was pacing behind his desk, counting his steps, a habit she noticed he did when he was thinking. 14 steps to the wall. Turn. 14 steps back. Read the weekly yield from the docks again, Arthur ordered, his back to her. Nora sighed, flipping the heavy ledger open. She had read it 3 times already. Arthur, the numbers haven't changed in the last 20 minutes. The yield is down 12%. Reading it again isn't going to magically put money back in the cargo containers. Arthur stopped pacing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The silence stretched, tight and dangerous. Outside the heavy oak doors, Nora knew Vincent and 2 other guards were standing post. If Arthur shouted, they would rush in. What did you say? Arthur asked softly. I said the numbers are the same, Nora replied, not looking up from the ledger. She reached for her lukewarm coffee. You're obsessing. It's bad for your blood pressure. Arthur turned slowly. I did not ask for medical advice. I asked you to read. And I'm telling you, it's a waste of my time and yours, Nora retorted. If you want to know why the yield is down, you should probably ask why the union rep at Pier 4 bought a brand new Mercedes last week. It's in the expense report you had me read yesterday. Arthur stood perfectly still. He digested the information, his jaw clenched, then relaxed. Call Vincent in here. Nora picked up the desk phone and pressed the intercom. Vincent, he needs you. Vincent entered a moment later, his eyes darting between Arthur and Nora, assessing the threat level. Boss? Bring me the union rep from Pier 4, Arthur said, his voice dead flat. Don't let him stop at home first. Understood, Vincent said. He glanced at Nora, a look of profound bewilderment on his face, before backing out of the room. When the door clicked shut, Arthur walked back to his desk. He reached out, his hand brushing the edge of the oak wood to orient himself, then sat down. You noticed the car, he said. I read what's on the paper, Nora said. She closed the ledger. You have a meeting with the Sullivan brothers in 20 minutes. You need to fix your tie. It's crooked. Arthur frowned, his hands coming up to his throat. He fumbled with the silk knot, pulling it the wrong way and making it tighter. He let out a frustrated breath, his hands dropping to his lap. It was a rare crack in his armor, a flash of the deep, suffocating helplessness he worked so hard to hide. Nora watched him for a second. The cynical part of her brain told her to look away. He was a mob boss. He ordered people beaten, maybe worse. He wasn't her problem, but he also looked like a man drowning in a teacup. Nora stood up and walked around the desk. Arthur flinched slightly at the sound of her approaching footsteps, his chin tipping up. "What are you doing?" he snapped, his voice sharp with defensiveness. "Fixing it. Hold still," Nora said. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into his personal space, close enough to smell the bergamot soap he used and the sharp tang of adrenaline coming off his skin. She reached out and took the silk tie in her hands. Arthur went rigidly tense, his breathing hitched. No one touched him. Not unless it was calculated, careful, and preceded by a warning. His hands hovered over the armrests, his knuckles white. Nora ignored his panic. She undid the messy knot with quick, efficient movements, her knuckles brushing briefly against the warm skin of his throat. She didn't linger. She didn't treat him like he was fragile. She just tied a perfect Windsor knot, smoothed the collar of his shirt, and took a step back. "There, you look intimidating again," she said casually, walking back to her seat. Arthur slowly exhaled. He reached up, his fingers brushing the perfectly tied knot. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't say anything at all for a long time. "Nora," he said quietly, his blind eyes aimed in her general direction. "Yeah. Don't move my coffee mug again. It belongs on the right side of the phone." Nora looked at the mug she had absent-mindedly shifted to the left while she was cleaning up earlier. She smiled, just a little. "Noted, boss." The restaurant was in the basement of a nondescript building in Little Italy, a private room that smelled of garlic, red wine, and old grudges. Nora sat in a hard wooden chair tucked into the corner, a leather portfolio resting on her knees. At the center of the room was a round table. Arthur sat on one side, flanked by Vincent. Across from them sat Leon, a capo who controlled the gambling rings on the south side. Leon was a large, sweating man with a cheap suit and a nervous laugh. Nora had been working for Arthur for 3 weeks. She had learned the rhythm of his life. She knew that he tapped his index finger when he was lying, that he drank his coffee black because milk made his stomach turn, and that he hated pity more than he hated his enemies. Tonight was a sit-down, a negotiation of territory. "Arthur, come on," Leon was saying, holding his hands out expansively. "We go way back. I'm telling you, the profits from the underground games have dried up. The cops are cracking down. I can't give you the usual percentage this month." Arthur sat with his hands folded on the table. His unseeing eyes were fixed straight ahead. "The cops aren't cracking down on the south side, Leon. The precinct captain is on my payroll. It's the new rookies, Arthur. They don't know the arrangement yet." Leon lied smoothly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. From her corner, Nora watched Leon. She watched his hands. As he spoke, Leon subtly pulled a folded piece of paper from his inside jacket pocket. He slid it across the table, not to Arthur, but toward Vincent. It was a quiet, deliberate movement. A bribe. A side deal being offered right in front of the blind boss. Vincent looked at the paper, his face unreadable. He didn't touch it, but he didn't push it back either. Nora felt a flare of cold irritation. They were treating Arthur like he wasn't even in the room, like he was a piece of furniture they could maneuver around. Arthur, sensing the shift in the room's energy, tilted his head. "What's going on, Leon? You're breathing heavy." "Just stressed, Arthur." "Like I said, the money just isn't there," Leon said, tapping his finger lightly on the table right next to the folded paper, signaling Vincent to take it. Nora didn't think about the protocol. She didn't care about the Mafia rules she was supposedly breaking. She just stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the wooden floorboards, echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. All three men flinched. Nora walked calmly over to the table. She reached between Vincent and Leon, picked up the folded piece of paper, and opened it. "It looks like the money is there, Leon," Nora said, her voice dry and conversational. She looked at the numbers on the page. "In fact, it looks like you're offering Vincent a 20% cut of a secondary betting ring you've been running out of a laundromat on 5th Street, assuming he keeps quiet about it." The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Leon's face drained of color. He looked from Nora to Arthur, absolute terror pooling in his eyes. Vincent stiffened, his hand dropping to the holster at his waist, though it was unclear who he was intending to draw on. Arthur didn't move. He didn't shout. Slowly, a terrifying razor-thin smile spread across his face. "Is that so, Nora?" Arthur asked softly. "That's what the math says," Nora replied. She tossed the paper onto the center of the table. "He's skimming from you and trying to buy out your second-in-command right under your nose." Arthur turned his head toward Leon. The dead, milky eyes suddenly felt like they were piercing straight through the capo's skull. "Leon," Arthur whispered. "Arthur, I swear it's a misunderstanding," Leon stammered, pushing his chair back. "Vincent," Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. "Take Leon to the back room. Have a conversation with him about loyalty." "And Vincent?" Vincent swallowed hard. "Yes, boss. If you ever hesitate to show me a piece of paper again, you'll be joining him permanently." Vincent nodded sharply, though Arthur couldn't see it. He grabbed Leon by the collar of his cheap suit and hauled him out of the room. The capo's frantic apologies were cut off as the heavy door slammed shut. Silence descended on the private dining room again. Nora stood by the table. Her heart was beating a little faster than normal, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. She had just essentially signed a man's death warrant. But looking at Arthur, she didn't feel regret. She felt tired. Arthur slowly reached out. His hand brushed the table, finding the piece of paper Nora had thrown down. He picked it up, folding it between his fingers. "You stepped out of line," Arthur said. The anger was gone from his voice. It was replaced by something quieter, something searching. "He was treating you like an idiot," Nora said defensively, crossing her arms. "I hate watching people get taken advantage of." "I am the head of the most violent syndicate in this city," Arthur said, turning his face toward her. "I don't need you to protect me." "I wasn't protecting you," Nora scoffed. "I was doing my job. You pay me to read things. I read it." Arthur let out a sound that was half a huff, half a laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing the scarred side of his face. "Sit down, Nora," he said. Nora pulled out the chair next to him and sat. "Pour me a glass of wine," he ordered. Nora reached for the bottle of expensive red in the center of the table. She poured a generous measure into a glass and slid it toward him, guiding his hand to the stem so he wouldn't knock it over. Arthur took a sip. He rested the glass on his knee. "Most people," Arthur started, his voice low, "look at me and see a ghost. A dead man walking. They wait for me to trip, or they try to steal from me because they think I can't see them doing it." He turned his head, his blind eyes fixing on her face with eerie precision. "Why don't you?" Nora looked at him, at the brutal scar, at the exhausted set of his shoulders. "Because you're not a ghost, Arthur," she said plainly. "You're just a blind guy with a terrible temper and a lot of paperwork. And honestly, I've dealt with worse." For the first time since he lost his sight, Arthur Cornero genuinely smiled. "Pour yourself a glass, Nora. We're going to be here a while." The transition from temporary assistant to indispensable asset didn't happen overnight. It was built in increments. A shifted coffee cup, a re-tied Windsor knot, a dead capo. By her second month, Nora's thrifted blazers were gone, replaced by sharp, tailored wool coats paid for by the company expense account. She wasn't just reading ledgers anymore. She was filtering them. She became the gatekeeper to the ghost of the West Side, and the men in the syndicate hated it. They hated that they had to hand their reports to a 20-something woman with deadpan eyes and a relentless bullshit detector. It was a freezing Thursday morning in November. The air inside the South Brooklyn shipping warehouse tasted of salt, diesel exhaust, and wet concrete. Arthur stood near the edge of loading bay number 4, the collar of his black cashmere overcoat turned up against the biting wind coming off the harbor. He had his hands buried deep in his pockets. He looked entirely at ease, a predator resting in the cold. Nora stood 2 feet to his right. She held a clipboard, her fingers numb inside her leather gloves. Surrounding them in a loose, heavily armed perimeter were Vincent and 4 of Arthur's enforcers. They were waiting on a shipment from the Costanza family, a gesture of good faith after the mess with Leon. A massive yellow forklift lowered a wooden shipping crate onto the concrete floor with a heavy, hollow thud. The forklift backed away, its backup alarm piercing the quiet of the warehouse. 2 of the Costanza men stood by the crate. They looked nervous. "Open it," Arthur said. He didn't raise his voice over the wind. He didn't need to. One of the men grabbed a crowbar and wedged it under the wooden lid, straining until the nails shrieked and gave way. He pulled the lid back. "Describe it," Arthur murmured, leaning slightly toward Nora. Nora stepped forward. The men tensed, but Arthur raised a single finger, freezing them in place. Nora walked up to the open crate and looked inside. "It's packed with straw," Nora said, her voice steady. "Underneath the straw there are wooden boxes, about the size of a shoebox. They're unmarked." "Open one," Arthur commanded. The Costanza man with the crowbar looked at his partner, then reached in and pried the lid off one of the smaller boxes. He stepped back. Nora peered inside. "It's what you asked for. Rifles, broken down into parts. They look clean." "Do they smell clean?" Arthur asked. Nora blinked. "What? Metal has a scent. Oil has a scent," Arthur said, his blind eyes tracking the sound of her footsteps as she shifted her weight. "Gunpowder has a scent. Do they smell fresh from a factory, or do they smell like they've been sitting in a damp basement for 3 years collecting rust?" Nora leaned closer to the box. She inhaled. It smelled sharp, acrid. But beneath the heavy layer of machine oil, there was a faint, sour tang of mildew and old dirt. She stood back up. She looked at the 2 Costanza men. Their eyes were wide, silently begging her to just say it was fine. "They smell like a basement," Nora said flatly. "There's pitting on the barrel of the top one. It's subtle, but it's rust." The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the sloshing of the grey harbour water against the concrete pylons outside. Arthur slowly pulled his hands out of his pockets. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was infinitely worse. "Carmine," Arthur said softly, addressing the older of the 2 Costanza men. "When I asked your boss for a resupply, did I say I wanted the surplus garbage you couldn't sell to street gangs in the 90s? Mr. Cornero, I swear to God, we didn't pack the crates." Carmine stammered, holding his hands up. "Vincent," Arthur interrupted. Vincent didn't draw a weapon. He just stepped forward, grabbed Carmine by the lapels of his heavy jacket, and shoved him violently against the side of the wooden crate. The wood groaned under the impact. Carmine gasped. The wind knocked out of him. "Take the crate back," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Tell Costanza that the next time he tries to offload rusted garbage on me, I won't send the crate back. I'll send you back inside it. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Carmine wheezed. "Understood." Arthur turned on his heel, his cane tapping sharply against the concrete. "We're done here, Nora. Let's go." Nora followed him toward the waiting town car. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Once they were settled in the warm, leather-scented interior of the car, the heavy doors thunking shut and sealing off the noise of the harbor. Arthur exhaled a long breath. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You're shaking," he observed. Nora looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly. "It's cold out there." "It's adrenaline," Arthur corrected. He turned his head toward her. "You could have lied. You saw the way those men looked at you. You knew what would happen if you told the truth." "I don't work for them," Nora said, buckling her seatbelt. "I work for you. And frankly, if you start buying cheap guns, the people shooting back at us might actually win. It's simple self-preservation." Arthur's mouth quirked at the corner. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. "Drink," he said. Nora took it. She didn't wipe the rim. She took a pull of the liquor inside. It burned like hellfire going down, a high-proof bourbon that immediately spread a knot of heat in her chest. She coughed, handing it back. Arthur took a drink himself, the silver flashing in the dim light of the car. "You're learning how to see the ugly things," Arthur said quietly, resting the flask on his knee. "Most people close their eyes when it gets dark. You're keeping yours wide open." "Someone has to," Nora replied, looking out the tinted window at the grey city rolling by. The penthouse was a tomb of glass and steel. It occupied the top 2 floors of a high-rise, a sprawling testament to Arthur's wealth and paranoia. The elevator required a keycard, a retinal scan, and a 4-digit code. Nora hated the apartment. It was too quiet. The air filtration system hummed with a sterile, white noise persistence that made her ears ring. It was 2:08 a.m. They had been working late on the monthly books. The cost of running an empire didn't sleep, and Arthur's insomnia had been worse than usual. Nora sat on a massive, low-profile grey sofa in the living room, a laptop burning hot against her thighs. Arthur was in his study, a room devoid of computers but filled with filing cabinets, braille documents, and a heavy wooden desk. He had been in there for an hour, supposedly making phone calls. Then the crash happened. It wasn't a small sound. It was the violent, shattering explosion of heavy glass hitting hardwood. Nora flinched, the laptop nearly sliding off her lap. She sat frozen for 3 seconds, listening. There was no shouting, no scuffle, just heavy, ragged breathing. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the expensive rug, and walked toward the study. The door was ajar. She pushed it open. The room smelled of scotch. A heavy crystal decanter lay in ruins on the floor, an amber puddle bleeding into the imported wood. Arthur stood in the center of the room. His tie was gone, his collar was undone, and his sleeves were rolled up. His chest was heaving. Both of his hands were pressed hard over his eyes, his fingers digging fiercely into his temples, as if trying to crush his own skull. He didn't hear her come in. He was entirely consumed by whatever war was raging inside his head. "Stop!" he hissed through clenched teeth, his voice a raw, desperate rasp. "Just stop!" Nora didn't move. She knew the medical term. Charles Bonnet syndrome. Visual hallucinations caused by the brain trying to compensate for sudden blindness. He had never talked about it, but Vincent had quietly warned her. Sometimes the ghost saw things that weren't there, flashes of light, shapes. Sometimes the explosion that took his sight played on a loop in the dark. "Arthur," Nora said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the silence. Arthur flinched violently. His hands dropped from his face. The scarred side of his face was flushed, his milky eyes wide and frantic. He looked completely disoriented. He took a stumbling step backward, his heel catching on the edge of the heavy desk. "Who is that?" he demanded, his hand dropping instinctively to his waist, where a gun usually sat. He wasn't wearing it. "It's Nora," she said. She didn't soften her voice. She didn't coo at him. She spoke with the same flat, grounding tone she used when reading the doc reports. "You're in your study. It's 2 a.m. You just broke a very expensive decanter." Arthur's breathing was shallow and fast. "It won't turn off. The light, it's burning." He reached up again, clawing at his scarred eye. Nora crossed the room in 3 quick strides. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed his wrists. Arthur was massive. He was built from muscle and violence, and he could have snapped her arms like twigs. The moment her hands clamped down on his wrists, his muscles locked. A low, warning growl built in his chest. "Let go of me," he commanded, a dangerous edge returning to his voice. "No," Nora said. She dug her fingers into the thick tendons of his wrists, forcing them down, away from his face. "You're going to tear your own skin open. Stop it. You don't understand," he ground out, pulling against her grip. He was stronger, slowly dragging her arms up. "It's on fire. The room is on fire." "It's not," Nora said, planting her feet. She stepped closer, invading his space, forcing him to focus on the physical reality of her presence. "There's no fire, Arthur. It's dark. It's quiet. Smell the air. Does it smell like smoke?" Arthur stopped fighting her for a fraction of a second. His chest heaved. He inhaled sharply through his nose. He smelled the spilled scotch. He smelled the sterile ozone of the air purifier. He smelled the faint, lingering scent of cheap vanilla shampoo that Nora always used. "No," he whispered, the fight draining out of his shoulders. "Right," Nora said. She didn't let go of his wrists, but she loosened her grip, sliding her hands down until she was holding his large, calloused hands in hers. "Now feel this." "What is this?" She pressed his right hand flat against the heavy oak wood of his desk. Arthur's fingers twitched against the grain. "My desk. And this?" She guided his left hand to the brass lamp sitting on the corner. "The lamp." His voice was losing its frantic edge, dropping back into its normal, gravelly register. "You're in your apartment. You're safe. Your brain is just lying to you," Nora said, her voice steady. "Tell it to shut up." Arthur stood there, his hands anchored to the physical world by her direction. His breathing slowly leveled out. The terrifying vulnerability on his face hardened, snapping back behind his usual mask of cold indifference. He pulled his hands away from hers, taking a deliberate step back. "I'm fine," he said strictly, though his voice still carried a slight tremor. "I know you are," Nora said, turning her back on him. She didn't offer pity. She didn't try to hug him. She walked over to the closet, pulled out a small broom and dustpan, and walked back to the shattered crystal on the floor. She knelt down and started sweeping up the glass. The rhythmic swish, clatter, filled the room. Arthur stood in silence, listening to her work. "You didn't run," Arthur said softly, breaking the quiet. "I'm not cleaning up this glass in the dark by myself," Nora replied, dumping the shards into the plastic bin. "Besides, I've seen you handle a ledger. Your paperwork is way more terrifying than your panic attacks." A long beat of silence passed. Then Arthur let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his dark hair. He stepped carefully around the wet spot on the rug, navigating back to his leather chair. "Pour me a glass of water, Nora, and read me the numbers from the Bronx crew again." Sure thing, boss. The betrayal didn't come with a warning. It never does. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, disguised as a routine drop-off. They were in the back of Arthur's armored SUV. Vincent was driving. A heavily armed escort car was in front of them, navigating the narrow, congested streets of the meatpacking district. Arthur had ordered a direct collection from a stubborn bookie who had missed 3 payments. It was supposed to be a message. Nora sat beside Arthur, reading emails aloud from her phone. Arthur sat with his head tilted back against the leather headrest, his cane resting between his knees. The contractor says the renovations on the new club will take another 3 weeks due to permit delays. Nora read. Tell him he has 2, or I'll break his legs and use the permits as splints, Arthur replied without opening his eyes. I'll paraphrase that to highly disappointed and expecting expediency, Nora muttered, her thumbs flying across the screen. Up ahead, the escort car suddenly slammed on its brakes. The heavy SUV jolted as Vincent hit the brakes a second later, throwing Nora forward against her seatbelt. The tires screeched against the asphalt. What the hell is that? Vincent shouted, throwing the SUV into park. Nora looked up. A massive, rusted garbage truck had pulled out from an alleyway, completely blocking the street ahead, pinning the escort car. Before anyone could process the roadblock, a black van slammed into the rear bumper of their SUV with a bone-jarring crunch. They were boxed in. "Ambush!" Vincent roared, drawing his weapon. The air shattered. Gunfire erupted from the rooftops and the alleyways, hammering against the armored glass of the SUV. The sound was deafening, a relentless, concussive roar that vibrated through the metal frame of the car, the reinforced windows spiderwebbed under the impact of heavy-caliber rounds, turning opaque white. "Get down!" Arthur bellowed, his hand shooting out blindly. He found Nora's shoulder and shoved her ruthlessly down toward the floorboards. Nora hit the floor hard, her phone clattering away. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. The noise was unbearable. She smelled burnt gunpowder and hot metal. Up front, Vincent kicked his door open, using the armored frame as a shield as he returned fire. "It's the Rossi crew. They've got long guns on the roof." "Vincent, get us out of here!" Arthur yelled over the chaos. A heavy slug punched through the windshield, missing Vincent's head by inches and burying itself in the leather passenger seat. "I can't move the car. Engine block is hit," Vincent shouted, firing 3 rapid shots. He cursed violently. "I'm pinned! Boss, you gotta move! The passenger side door is in a blind spot for the shooters on the left." Arthur didn't hesitate. He reached down to his ankle and pulled a sleek, matte black Glock. He racked the slide with one smooth motion, but as he sat up, he froze. He was in a metal box under heavy fire, and he was completely, utterly blind. He couldn't see the shooters. He couldn't see the escape route. For the first time since the explosion, Nora saw true, naked helplessness flash across his face. He held the gun, his knuckles white, his head darting back and forth, listening to the ricochets, unable to aim, unable to protect himself. He was a sitting duck. "Arthur!" Nora screamed over the gunfire. He didn't hear her. He was hyperventilating, the noise overwhelming his remaining senses. Nora scrambled up from the floorboards, ignoring the bullets raining down on the roof. She grabbed his arm. "Arthur, listen to me!" she yelled, pressing her mouth close to his ear. He flinched, turning his unseeing eyes toward her voice. "Nora, get down! No, you need me!" she shouted. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her voice was terrifyingly steady. Adrenaline wiped out the fear, leaving only cold mechanics. "Slide out the passenger door. Now!" Arthur didn't argue. He moved with brutal efficiency. He threw his weight against the heavy door, pushing it open. He spilled out onto the dirty asphalt, pulling Nora down with him, behind the cover of the rear tire. Concrete dusted them as bullets chewed up the street inches away. "Where are they?" Arthur demanded, pressing his back against the tire, his gun raised. Nora peeked around the bumper. Her eyes scanned the chaos. 2 on the fire escape across the street. 2nd floor. 1 moving behind the garbage truck. "Distance," Arthur ordered, his voice suddenly dead calm. The panic was gone. He had a job to do. He just needed the data. "Fire escape is 40 feet, Nora said, forcing her breathing to slow. "Elevation is 20 feet up." Arthur raised his gun, resting his forearms on the hood of the car. "Give me the clock." 2 o'clock, high, Nora said. Arthur adjusted his aim slightly. "Left 2 inches, Nora corrected, watching the shooter lean over the railing. "Fire." Arthur pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. The concussive blasts made Nora's ears ring. Across the street, the shooter on the fire escape jerked backward, his rifle falling from his hands as he crumpled over the metal grating. "One down," Nora gasped, her eyes wide. "The second one is moving down the stairs. 3 o'clock, ground level, 30 feet. Arthur shifted his stance, tracking the invisible geometry she was feeding him. He moved like a machine, perfectly calibrated, waiting for the input. "He's behind a mailbox," Nora said. "Wait, he's leaning out. Now!" Arthur fired twice. The man by the mailbox spun and dropped, clutching his shoulder. "Truck!" Vincent yelled from the front of the car. "They're moving in on foot!" Nora looked left. 3 men were advancing from the alleyway, using the black van for cover. "Arthur, left side!" Nora yelled, grabbing his jacket and pulling him hard toward the rear bumper. 9 o'clock. Close. 20 feet. Coming around the van. Arthur didn't aim high this time. He aimed low, toward the gap under the van. "Tell me when you see feet." Nora watched the gap. Boots appeared, shuffling rapidly toward them. "Now!" Arthur opened fire under the van. Screams echoed as the rounds found kneecaps and shins. 2 men went down hard, their weapons clattering across the asphalt. Sirens wailed in the distance, the sharp, piercing wail of police cruisers cutting through the city. The remaining shooters realized their ambush had failed. Gunfire tapered off as they scrambled back into the alleyways, leaving their wounded behind. Silence slammed back down on the street, broken only by the hiss of a punctured radiator and the distant sirens. Vincent sagged against the front tire, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but alive. "Clear!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. Nora slumped back against the side of the SUV. Her legs gave out, and she slid down to the asphalt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands were covered in street grime. She couldn't stop shaking. Arthur slowly lowered his gun. He ejected the magazine, caught it in his palm, and slapped a fresh one in by pure muscle memory. He holstered the weapon. He turned his head toward where Nora was sitting. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer empty comforts. He walked over, his boots crunching on broken glass, and crouched down beside her. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before finding her shoulder. He slid his hand up, his fingers brushing the side of her neck, feeling the frantic, galloping pulse jumping beneath her skin. He left his hand there, a warm, heavy weight anchoring her to the ground. "You did good, Nora," Arthur said quietly, the gravel in his voice completely stripped of its usual cruelty. "You did exactly what you had to do." Nora closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the dented metal of the car, letting the reality of what just happened wash over her. She had just directed a blind mob boss to shoot 3 people. She wasn't just reading ledgers anymore. She was writing them in blood. "You owe me a new phone," Nora whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I dropped it in the car." Arthur let out a soft, genuine laugh that was entirely out of place in the blood-soaked street. "I'll buy you the company," Arthur replied. He stood up, offering her his hand. Nora looked at his hand for a moment. Then she reached up and took it, letting the ghost of the West Side pull her up from the wreckage. The penthouse smelled of antiseptic, copper, and expensive scotch. Arthur sat shirtless on the edge of his kitchen island. A doctor, a quiet, pale man who took cash and asked 0 questions, was carefully pulling a shard of tempered glass from Arthur's left shoulder. Arthur didn't flinch. He just held a highball glass of amber liquid, his knuckles white, his unseeing eyes staring straight ahead. Nora stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights. She had washed her hands 3 times, but she could still feel the phantom grit of asphalt and gun oil under her fingernails. Her ears were still ringing, a high, thin whine that refused to fade. The doctor finished the last stitch, snipped the thread, and taped a gauze pad over the wound. "Keep it dry. I'll be back in 2 days to check for infection." "Show him out, Vincent," Arthur said, his voice flat. Vincent, sporting a butterfly bandage over his eyebrow, nodded and led the doctor to the private elevator. The heavy doors slid shut, sealing the apartment in a heavy, suffocating silence. Arthur set his glass down on the marble counter. The clink was loud in the empty room. "There's a duffel bag in the bottom drawer of my desk," Arthur said. He didn't turn his head. He spoke to the empty air between them. "It has $200,000 in unmarked bills. Clean money. There's a passport in there, too. Blank. You just need to fill in the photo." Nora turned away from the window. She crossed her arms, shivering slightly despite the aggressive heating system in the apartment. "Are you firing me?" "I'm giving you an out," Arthur corrected. He ran his hand over his face, careful to avoid the jagged scar. "You're a civilian, Nora. You read ledgers. You make coffee. You're not supposed to be calling out targets in a firefight with the Rossi family." "I did what I had to do," she said defensively. "We were pinned, and you saved my life," Arthur said. He finally turned his head, his milky eyes finding her general direction. The exhaustion etched into his features was profound. "But they saw you. They heard you. You aren't just the temp anymore. You're the eyes of the boss. That makes you the highest value target in this city." Nora walked slowly toward the kitchen island. She looked at his bruised ribs, the fresh bandage on his shoulder, the sprawling, violent tattoos that wrapped around his arms. He looked indestructible, but she knew exactly how fragile he was. She had felt his pulse racing against her fingers just an hour ago. "I don't want the duffel bag, Arthur." "Don't be stupid," he snapped, a flash of his usual temper returning. "Rossi won't stop. He knows my weakness now. He knows I can't aim a gun without someone holding my hand." "I wasn't holding your hand. I was doing my job." Nora stopped 2 feet away from him. And you aren't weak. You just need a better system." "I'm a good system." Arthur let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You're a 26-year-old girl who was eating saltines for dinner 3 months ago. You don't belong in this." "Maybe I don't," Nora agreed plainly. "But I'm not leaving, because if I leave, you'll hire some terrified kid from the agency who will freeze the second a gun goes off, and you'll die. And frankly, the pay here is too good, and I like the dental plan." Arthur went perfectly still. He listened to her breathing. He listened to the steady, unbothered rhythm of her heart. He reached out. His large hand hovered in the space between them, searching. Nora didn't step back. She stepped forward, letting his fingers brush against her waist. He slid his hand around to the small of her back, gripping the fabric of her ruined blouse. He pulled her a half-step closer. He didn't pull her into a kiss. He just pressed his forehead against her shoulder, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. It was a terrifying surrender of control. The ghost of the West Side, leaning on his secretary. "If you stay," Arthur whispered, his voice muffled against her collarbone, "I won't be able to let you go. Ever. You understand that?" Nora rested her hand on the back of his neck, her fingers tangling slightly in his dark hair. "I'll have my desk cleared of the cheap coffee by tomorrow morning, boss." The war with the Rossi family turned the city into a meat grinder over the next 3 weeks. Arthur's empire bled, but he retaliated with ruthless, surgical precision. He didn't attend meetings in person anymore. He operated from the penthouse, a spider in a web of burner phones and whispered reports. Nora was his filter, his strategist, and his eyes. She learned to read the hesitation in a capo's voice over the phone. She learned to spot the discrepancies in the protection payouts. She became untouchable. Vincent assigned 2 shadows to her at all times, but a fortress is only as strong as its weakest guard. It happened on a rainy Tuesday. Nora was in the underground parking garage of the syndicate's main holding company, reviewing a stack of manifest documents in the back of the armored SUV. Her 2 guards were standing by the bumper, smoking. She didn't hear the scuffle. She only heard the wet, sickening thud of a body hitting concrete, followed by a suppressed gunshot. Nora dropped the clipboard. She reached for the panic button wired under the armrest, but before her fingers could find the plastic ridge, the heavy door of the SUV was ripped open. A man in a wet trench coat leaned in. He had a brutal, flat nose and a suppressed pistol aimed directly at her face. "Don't scream," the man said. Nora looked past him. Both of her guards were on the ground in growing pools of dark blood. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The icy, cynical survival instinct that had kept her alive this long took over. She slowly raised her hands. "Arthur is going to peel your skin off," Nora said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. The man smirked. "He's got to find us in the dark first, sweetheart. Let's go." 20 minutes later, Arthur's private phone rang on the heavy oak desk in the penthouse. It was a specific ringtone, the one reserved for emergencies. Arthur, who had been pacing, stopped dead. He felt his way to the desk, picked up the receiver, and pressed it to his ear. He didn't speak. "Arthur Cornero," a voice purred on the other end. It was Dominic Rossi, the head of the rival family. "I hear you've been relying heavily on your administrative staff lately." Arthur's blood turned to ice. The temperature in the room plummeted. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight. "Where is she, Dominic?" Arthur asked. His voice was not angry. It was a hollow, dead whisper, the sound of a grave opening. "She's having a lovely time at the old cold storage facility in the Bronx," Rossi gloated. "You know the one. You used to hang my guys on the meat hooks there. Poetic, really. Come alone, Arthur. Just you, your cane, and your wallet. Sign over the docs and maybe I'll let her keep her fingers." "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Arthur said. "Bring a flashlight, blind man. It's dark in here." Rossi hung up. Arthur slowly placed the phone back on the cradle. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything. He walked to his desk drawer, opened it, and pulled out 2 spare magazines for his Glock. He slid them into his pockets. Vincent burst into the room, his face pale, clutching a bleeding wound on his arm. "Boss!" "They took her. The guards in the garage were bought off. I just found them." "I know," Arthur said. He walked past Vincent, his cane completely ignored, left leaning against the desk. He didn't need it right now. The layout of the penthouse was burned into his muscles. "Boss, we need to mobilize the crew. We hit them with everything." "No," Arthur cut him off. He stopped at the door. "If we bring an army, Dominic will shoot her in the head before we breach the lobby. I go alone." "Arthur, you can't. It's a trap. They want you stumbling around in there. They'll execute you." Arthur turned his scarred face toward his second-in-command. The milky eyes were dead, but the aura radiating off the man was suffocatingly violent. "Dominic Rossi thinks my blindness is a weakness," Arthur said softly. "He thinks he's dragging me into the dark." A terrifying, jagged smile touched the corner of Arthur's mouth. "He forgets that I live there." The abandoned meatpacking plant smelled of rust, stagnant water, and old blood. It was a cavernous, sprawling labyrinth of steel corridors and heavy refrigeration doors. Nora was zip-tied to a metal chair in the center of the main butchering floor. A single, blinding, industrial halogen lamp was pointed directly at her, turning the rest of the massive room into a pitch-black void. Dominic Rossi stood at the edge of the light, flanked by 6 men holding suppressed automatic rifles. Rossi was checking his watch. 10 minutes, Rossi muttered, lighting a cigarette. The ghost is running late. Maybe he tripped on a curb. His men chuckled. Nora sat perfectly still. The plastic zip ties were biting into her wrists, but she wasn't struggling. She was listening. The building groaned and dripped, but beneath the ambient noise, she heard it. The heavy thud of the main breaker box being ripped open in the corridor outside. "He's not late," Nora said, her voice cutting through the damp air. "He's just getting comfortable." Before Rossi could respond, a massive, deafening clack echoed through the plant. The halogen lamp died. The emergency exit signs died. The building plunged into absolute, suffocating, pitch-black darkness. Not a sliver of moonlight. Not a street lamp. Total eclipse. "Hey! What the hell?" Rossi shouted, his voice suddenly tinged with panic. "Turn on the flashlights! Night vision! Get the goggles on!" Several frantic clicks echoed in the dark as flashlights flickered on. But they were weak, slicing through the dusty air like thin white lasers, illuminating only small patches of rusted metal and concrete. They were blinding themselves with their own beams, ruining whatever natural night vision their eyes were trying to build. Then came the sound, a metallic drag, heavy boots stepping softly on wet concrete. It was coming from the catwalk above them. "Up there! Fire!" Rossi screamed. 3 rifles opened up, chewing the metal catwalk to pieces. Sparks rained down in the dark, illuminating brief, strobe-light flashes of empty space. There was no one there. Thwip, thwip. 2 suppressed shots coughed from the floor level, 50 feet to their right. 2 of Rossi's men dropped, the sound of their bodies hitting the concrete heavy and wet. The flashlights on their rifles clattered to the floor, rolling aimlessly. "He's on the floor! Spread out!" Rossi shrieked, firing his own pistol blindly into the dark. Panic was a virus, and Arthur was the carrier. In the light, they were trained killers. In the absolute dark, they were prey. Arthur didn't need to see them. He could hear their ragged breathing. He could hear the squeak of their rubber soles. He could smell the cheap cologne and the metallic tang of fear sweat. He was a shadow, moving seamlessly through his own element. Thwip. Another shot. Another body hit the floor. "Shoot the girl!" Rossi bellowed, realizing his leverage was his only way out. "Kill her!" Nora didn't wait to be a victim. She threw her body weight sideways. The metal chair tipped over with a loud crash, slamming her hard against the freezing concrete just as a hail of bullets ripped through the space where her chest had been a second ago. She lay on the floor, gasping for air, her wrists screaming in pain. "Arthur!" she yelled. 4 o'clock, 30 feet, heavy breathing." Arthur didn't need distance and elevation this time. He just needed the anchor of her voice. He lunged from the cover of a rusted meat hook. He didn't shoot. He moved too fast. He grabbed the barrel of the nearest rifle, wrenching it upward as it fired harmlessly into the ceiling. With his other hand, he drove a combat knife straight into the shooter's throat. 4 down, 2 left, plus Rossi. "Where is he?" The last 2 men screamed, swinging their flashlight beams wildly, catching nothing but dust motes and blood spray. Arthur picked up a loose bolt from the floor and tossed it across the room. It clattered loudly against a metal door. Both men spun toward the sound, firing blindly. Arthur stepped out from the darkness directly behind them. He raised his Glock and fired twice. Thwip! Thwip! The room fell dead silent. The only sound was the drip of water and Dominic Rossi's frantic, hyperventilating breath. Rossi's flashlight beam shook violently. He backed up, sweeping the light left and right. Arthur, wait, we can talk. We can negotiate the territory." Arthur didn't say anything. Rossi bumped into a concrete pillar. He spun around, shining the light. Arthur was standing 3 feet away. The light hit Arthur's face. The milky, dead eyes stared blankly ahead, the jagged scar looking demonic in the harsh, white beam. But his gun was raised, pointed with terrifying, absolute precision, directly at the center of Rossi's forehead. "You brought me into the dark, Dominic," Arthur whispered. His voice was calm, unbothered, the voice of a true apex predator. "But I own the dark." Arthur pulled the trigger. The flashlight dropped to the floor, rolling away and coming to a stop against a wall, casting long, eerie shadows across the slaughterhouse floor. Arthur stood still for a moment, listening. He waited for a heartbeat, a scrape of a boot, a shifting of weight. Nothing. The threats were neutralized. He holstered his weapon. "Nora, over here," she croaked from the floor. Arthur walked toward her voice, his steps precise and confident. He didn't stumble. He dropped to his knees beside the overturned chair. He found her shoulder in the dark, his hands moving quickly down her arms to the zip ties, biting into her wrists. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket, expertly flicking it open, and slid the cold steel under the plastic, snapping the bonds. Nora gasped, pulling her arms forward, rubbing her bruised wrists. She pushed herself up to a sitting position. Arthur stayed on his knees. He reached out, his hands finding her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, feeling for cuts, tracing her jawline to ensure she was whole. His touch was frantic, stripped of all its usual cold restraint. "Are you hit?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," Nora breathed. I'm okay. Arthur exhaled. He let his forehead drop until it rested against hers. In the pitch-black room, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies, they sat on the freezing concrete, sharing the same air. "I told you," Nora whispered, a faint, cynical smile touching her lips, even though he couldn't see it. "You really need a better security system." Arthur let out a low, raspy laugh. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her hair. "You're the only system I need," he said. 6 months later, the waiting room outside the corner office was empty. The temp agency had stopped sending girls long ago. Inside the office, the heavy blackout curtains were pulled back just an inch, letting a single, sharp slice of afternoon sunlight cut across the mahogany desk. Nora sat on the edge of the desk, her legs crossed, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that matched the boss's. She was reading the weekly yields from the docks. The numbers were up 20%. Arthur sat in his leather chair, a cup of black coffee exactly where it belonged on the right side of the phone. He was listening, his face relaxed, the terrifying aura of the ghost replaced by something grounded, something terrifyingly sharp. He didn't need eyes to see the empire they were building. He had her, and everyone in the city knew. If you wanted to speak to the boss, you had to survive the woman who wasn't afraid of the dark. If you loved this intense, action-packed conclusion between Arthur and Nora, do us a huge favor and smash that like button. We pour our hearts into these grounded, gritty Mafia romance stories, and your support means the world to us. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our upcoming uploads. Who was your favorite character in this story? Let us know in the comments below. Share this video with a friend who loves a fearless heroine, and we'll see you in the next dark romance.